Dan Perry is the former regional editor of Associated Press in Middle East and author of Ask Questions Later, Substack newsletter. He's joining us from Tel Aviv. Very good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. What's your assessment of why the Netanyahu coalition is insisting on the extension of Phase 1 and refusing to move on to talks about Phase 2 in the ceasefire?
Well, Phase 2 was meant to basically finalize the details by which the agreement would be implemented to its logical conclusion, which includes where when Israel gets back the last hostage, it ends the war, pulls out, and Hamas remains in power in Gaza. My reading of this is that Israel never was comfortable with that. The government never was. The government is beholden to far-right parties that would probably bring it down if it went ahead and executed that. And so they're trying to get away, really, from ever reaching an agreement on the second phase as such, and continue instead the first phase, whereby they continue to get back some hostages and then the war doesn't resume. The major question is whether in the end some mode will be found to enable the deal to be finished, and somehow to get around this blockage whereby Netanyahu feels, I think correctly, that if he actually implements a deal as it was written, as he was sort of forced to do by Trump in mid-January, his government will collapse. His government may, by the way, collapse for other reasons as well. But that is a major issue.
Since the beginning of this particular war, critics of Benjamin Netanyahu said that he made a fundamental error in essentially backing himself into a corner when he said that he had to eradicate Hamas, that he was going to remove Hamas completely in every particular form that it was currently in. Given the fact, what you're talking about in terms of trying to find a way forward in terms of these ceasefire talks, is there anything, any position do you think that Israel is able to take with regard to Hamas particularly in order to be able to move things forward?
Many people in Israel, and I think a majority of the public opinion in Israel, would have the government do the deal regardless of the political consequences, because the survival of Netanyahu is not a strategic imperative of the country. And I think the majority of Israelis want to prioritize the salvation of the hostages, and they're kind of tired of the war. They observe that over a year of this war hasn't removed Hamas from power in Gaza. It's caused tremendous damage to Hamas. It's weakened them, but they're still there. And there's an irony, because Hamas is still there partly because the government has refused any plan to replace them with anyone, because, again, the far right in the government, which prefers eternal occupation and indeed the settlement of Jews in Gaza, would have refused to countenance such a plan. So Israel's very much in a catch-22 situation where no matter where they go, some disaster looms. I think the only way forward, really, is for Israel to work with the world and the Arab League to create an incentive on Hamas and pressure on Hamas to agree to step aside. And I've noticed that other speakers on your channel, indeed after I appeared last time, seem to feel that Hamas has agreed to this in a way. A government of technocrats that would govern in their stead, and they would sort of be in the shadows. If that were made clear, then that would certainly be a step forward. However, I doubt Israel would agree to have that be the new arrangement where Hamas retains its militia fully armed and, in fact, is the power behind this technocratic government. I think it needs Arab League and Arab world pressure to make Hamas truly stand aside. But I don't think there's much appetite for extending the war and doing that militarily. That promises more misery for all sides.
I want to bring you back to a point that you were alluding to in your first answer, in the standing of Benjamin Netanyahu as Prime Minister and his apparent determination to remain in power. Give us some context for viewers who perhaps are coming to this story for the first time. Where does that desire by Benjamin Netanyahu to remain in power play into what we are seeing on the ground in Gaza, but also, of course, with regard to the ceasefire talks?
Look, you could say everything is a negotiation and what's presented in public isn't what will ultimately happen. And of course, whenever Trump is involved, then that's very much part of the paradigm. However, in the case of Netanyahu, I think his history has shown that his number one priority is staying in power. It's not even a question of far right or left or center from the point of view of what he would like to have happen. His current government prevents him from doing certain things. It prevents him from organizing a plausible day after planning for Gaza if Hamas were to step aside. So I think Netanyahu right now, in the view of many people in Israel, is an impediment. And if he were truly a patriot, then he would probably put aside calculations that have to do with his political expediency. After all, he is currently the prime minister who served more time in that position in Israel than anyone in the country's history, including David Ben-Gurion, the founding prime minister. And it would be no great disaster if this government of his that brought mostly calamity to Israel in the 2 and some years and 2 months of its existence were indeed to be replaced. And as I suggested before, there are other issues that could cause its collapse, including the fact that they may be unable to pass a budget, which has to pass within a month, largely because of the Haredi party's insistence on being given the right to permanent draft evasion at a time when the country is at war and running out of soldiers. And so they're not going to back the budget. And that would itself cause the government to collapse. So much more than may be visible from a distance, the government of Israel is between a rock and a hard place. And I think if it were replaced reasonably soon by a centrist government, that might open the way for a lot of solutions that today seem impossible. But I caution the Israelis' desire, any Israeli government's desire, to move Hamas aside from Gaza, disarm the group, and replace and bring instead a government that you could do business with and potentially move towards peace with. That desire is very, very strong. So I don't see a good future for the Middle East as long as Hamas remains armed and in control of the Gaza Strip.
It's really interesting to get your thoughts on this, Dan Perry. As always, we appreciate it. Thank you very much indeed.